The streets of Oak Hollow appeared pristine, an idyllic suburban neighborhood where life seemed perfect. Manicured lawns stretched across each property, and neighbors waved from behind white picket fences as children's laughter echoed down the road. On the surface, Oak Hollow was serene, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where things seemed safe. But beneath that calm exterior, dark secrets simmered, waiting to come to light. At the center of Oak Hollow stood the Morrison house, a gleaming two-story with a perfectly kept yard. David Morrison, a man in his mid-40s, appeared to embody the suburban ideal. Handsome, charismatic, and well-respected, he was a dedicated father and husband. To his neighbors, David was the perfect family man, always helping out around the community, always present at his son's events. But behind his charming smile, David carried a secret that threatened to destroy everything he had built. David's son, Jake, was the pride of Oak Hollow High School. At 18, he was the star athlete, popular, easygoing, and effortlessly likable. He idolized his father, seeing David as his role model and the person he could always turn to. They shared a tight bond, strengthened by years of father-son camaraderie, and Jake had no reason to suspect that his father was anything less than perfect. In Jake's eyes, David was his hero. But what Jake didn't know was that Ethan, his best friend, was more to his father than just a family friend. Ethan, at 19, was a year older than Jake and had a darker, more complicated past. He was quiet, introspective, with a mysterious aura that drew people in. Despite his troubled family background, Ethan and Jake had been inseparable since childhood. To Jake, Ethan was practically a brother. They spent their days together, trusting one another without question. Yet behind Jake's back, Ethan had been engaged in a secret, forbidden relationship with David for nearly a year. It had started innocently enough, late-night talks, moments of vulnerability, but it had quickly evolved into something more. David and Ethan's affair was fueled by passion and secrecy, a dangerous mix that neither of them could fully control. Ethan felt trapped, both by his feelings for David and the guilt he harbored for betraying his best friend. But David had a way of pulling him back in, promising that no one would ever find out. As the months passed, the strain of keeping the affair hidden began to wear on them both. Ethan, once comfortable around Jake, had grown distant. He avoided spending too much time at the Morrison house, afraid that one wrong move could expose everything. And David, usually so composed, was starting to feel the pressure too. Jake's innocent questions about Ethan's absence and his growing suspicion about the late-night phone calls left David on edge. But Jake, still oblivious, saw no reason to question his father or his best friend. To him, they were the two most important people in his life, and he trusted them completely. He looked up to David, admired his strength and leadership, and he cherished Ethan like a brother, never imagining that either of them could betray him. But the lies were closing in, and David knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The cracks in their carefully constructed facade were beginning to show, small, nearly imperceptible changes, a lingering glance, a hushed conversation, were easy to overlook, but they were there. Jake noticed them, though he couldn't quite place why things felt different. He shrugged it off, assuming Ethan was just going through a tough time. But something darker was brewing, and soon, the weight of those secrets would come crashing down on them all. David had always believed he could control the situation, that he could keep his two lives separate. But as the tension mounted, he realized he might have underestimated just how fragile the balance was. The truth was bound to come out, and when it did, it wouldn't just destroy his family, it would leave blood in its wake. The affair between David and Ethan had started innocently, as most forbidden things do. It was late one summer night a year ago, July 22nd, 2021 to be exact, when it first happened. David had been sitting out on the back porch, nursing a beer after a long day. He had always been a good listener, and when Ethan wandered out to join him that night, it didn't feel out of place. Ethan, who had just graduated high school and was wrestling with feelings of uncertainty about his future, had always found a sort of quiet reassurance in David's company. "I don't know what's next," Ethan had admitted that night, his voice tinged with frustration. "Everyone else seems to have a plan." David had smiled softly, a comforting figure in the dim light. You don't need to have it all figured out. You've got time. It was a simple conversation, but something shifted in the silence that followed. Ethan had been unusually quiet, staring out into the yard, and when David glanced over, he could see the strain on the young man's face. In that moment, David saw himself in Ethan, lost, vulnerable, searching for something to hold on to. And without thinking, he reached out, laying a hand on Ethan's shoulder. What should have been a brief moment of comfort lingered too long, the air thickening between them. David felt it, the subtle pull, and Ethan's eyes met his, questioning yet curious. When their lips met that first time, it was hesitant, tentative, but it unleashed something in both of them. For David, it was an escape from the predictability of his suburban life. For Ethan, it was validation from someone he admired, someone older and wiser. But as the weeks turned into months, their secret relationship deepened, and the thrill of secrecy turned into something darker, something neither of them could fully control. Ethan wrestled with guilt almost daily. Jake had been his best friend for years, the one person who had always been there for him. How could he betray him like this? Yet every time he thought about ending it, David would draw him back in, with soft reassurances and promises that no one would ever know. But Ethan knew the danger. He could feel it creeping closer with each stolen moment. Jake, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware at first. David had always been a little overbearing, so the late-night calls or Ethan stopping by the house didn't seem out of the ordinary. But as the fall of 2021 turned into winter, small, nagging suspicions began to take root. There was the way David and Ethan would exchange glances when they thought no one was looking, or how their conversations would suddenly hush whenever Jake entered the room. At first, Jake brushed it off. He knew his father and Ethan were close. They had bonded over shared interests. And Ethan had been quieter lately, sure, but Jake assumed that was just part of growing up. Still, the unease gnawed at him, small but persistent. January 2022 was when things started to feel undeniably off. One night, after getting home from a party, Jake noticed Ethan slipping out the back door of their house. "Where are you going?" Jake had asked, half joking, assuming Ethan was off to see a girl. Ethan's response had been a mumbled excuse about needing to get home, but the way he avoided Jake's gaze, the tension in his posture, it was enough to set off alarm bells. Jake shrugged it off at the time, but the memory lingered, replaying in his mind as other strange incidents began to pile up. It wasn't just the late-night exits. There were text messages on David's phone, messages from Ethan that seemed far too personal, far too frequent. One evening, as David showered, Jake noticed a text pop up on his father's phone. "Can't stop thinking about last night." Jake's stomach twisted, but he told himself he must have been misreading the situation. It couldn't mean what it seemed to mean. He deleted the notification without thinking, his hands trembling. March 2022 came, and the distance between Jake and Ethan grew more noticeable. Ethan had always been his closest friend, the person he could confide in. But lately, Ethan had become more withdrawn, more evasive, and it hurt Jake more than he cared to admit. He'd tried reaching out, inviting Ethan over for their usual video game nights, but Ethan always had an excuse, a paper to finish, a shift at work. Jake's protective instincts kicked in. Something was wrong, he could feel it. He worried that Ethan was in some kind of trouble, that maybe he was falling into a depression or worse. What Jake didn't realize was that the trouble lay much closer to home. David had been acting strangely, too. He'd always been the strong, confident type, but lately, he seemed jittery. Late-night phone calls, whispered conversations when he thought no one was around. It wasn't like him. And then there was the way he looked at Ethan. Jake hadn't wanted to admit it, but there was something odd there, something that made his skin crawl. It all came to a head one evening in April 2022. Jake had come home early from a friend's house, earlier than anyone expected. As he stepped inside, the house was eerily quiet, but he could hear low voices coming from the back of the house. As he moved closer, he recognized them, his father's and Ethan's. They were talking in hushed tones, and for some reason, Jake stopped short of entering the room. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, intimate, secretive. And then, the unmistakable sound of someone shuffling quickly, as if trying to hide something. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as a sense of dread washed over him. He stepped into the room just as David and Ethan abruptly pulled away from each other, both looking startled, as though they had been caught doing something they shouldn't. Ethan muttered something about having to go, brushing past Jake without making eye contact. For the first time, Jake felt the full weight of suspicion settling over him. Something was wrong, something terrible. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew now that it involved his father and his best friend. And he was going to find out what. May 17th, 2022. The day would be seared into Jake's memory forever, the day everything shattered. It started like any other afternoon. Jake had come home early from football practice, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he entered the house. The house was unusually quiet, his mother still at work, and his father was supposed to be out for a meeting. But as Jake headed toward his room, he noticed something. David's phone sitting on the kitchen counter buzzing with a new message. Jake wasn't the snooping type, but something made him hesitate. His father never left his phone lying around, especially not unlocked. The screen lit up with a notification, a message from Ethan. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible." Jake's heart stuttered in his chest. He stared at the message, the words blurring in his mind. His hand moved on its own, picking up the phone and scrolling through the messages. There they were, hundreds of texts between David and Ethan, stretching back months. Some were mundane, but others, explicit, filled with details of secret meetings, intimate moments shared in the dead of night. There were photos, too. Pictures of them together, laughing, touching, kissing. Jake's entire world tilted on its axis. For a moment, he just stood there, numb, unable to process what he was seeing. His father, his hero, the man he looked up to more than anyone, had been lying to him, betraying him. And Ethan, his best friend, the person he trusted with everything, had been complicit in the lie. Jake's vision blurred with rage. Without thinking, he shoved the phone into his pocket and stormed out of the house. His heart pounded in his chest as he got into his car, adrenaline spiking through his veins. He drove to Ethan's apartment, barely registering the passing streets. He could barely see through the red haze of betrayal clouding his mind. Ethan answered the door, surprised to see Jake. His face fell immediately when he noticed Jake's expression, anger so raw it was almost palpable. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, his voice hesitant, but Jake was already pushing past him into the apartment. He threw the phone onto the coffee table, where it landed with a dull thud, screen glowing with the damning evidence. "Explain this," Jake growled, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. Ethan's eyes darted to the phone, then back to Jake. His face went pale as the truth settled between them like a suffocating weight. "Jake, I can explain, You can explain?" Jake's voice rose, cracking with the weight of his emotion. "You've been screwing my dad behind my back! How could you do this? How could either of you do this?" Ethan stepped forward, hands raised in a desperate attempt to calm him. "Jake, it's not what you think. Not what I think." Jake's voice was filled with disbelief. "I've seen the messages, Ethan. I saw the pictures. You two have been lying to me for months. Do you even care about me at all?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Jake felt a pang of the friendship they used to have, the bond that had seemed unbreakable. But the pain of betrayal cut too deep. Ethan's silence, his inability to come clean, told Jake everything he needed to know. "I'm so sorry," Ethan whispered. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I never wanted to hurt you." "Hurt me?" Jake's voice broke, his hands trembling. "You've ruined everything." Ethan reached out, but Jake recoiled, stepping back toward the door. He couldn't even look at him anymore. The person who had once been his closest friend now felt like a stranger. "I trusted you," Jake whispered, his voice raw. "I trusted both of you." And with that, Jake turned and walked out, leaving Ethan standing in the ruins of what had once been their friendship. The drive home was a blur. By the time Jake pulled into the driveway, the anger had transformed into a sickening sense of dread. His father's car was parked outside, meaning David was home now. Jake clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as he stared at the house. He wasn't ready, but he knew he had to confront his father. Inside, David was sitting at the dining table, flipping through the day's mail. When he saw Jake, he smiled. "Hey, sport, how was practice?" Jake's stomach churned at the casual tone, at the sight of his father acting like everything was normal. His hands balled into fists as he walked over to the table and slammed the phone down in front of him. David looked at the phone, then up at Jake. His smile faltered. "What's this?" Jake's chest heaved with emotion as he stared at his father, his voice shaking. "You know what it is." David's face drained of color. He picked up the phone and saw the messages, the photos. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick with the weight of everything unspoken, everything shattered. "How long?" Jake's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "How long have you been lying to me?" David set the phone down, running a hand through his hair. "Jake, Don't!" Jake shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. You betrayed me, Dad. You lied to me, to Mom, to everyone." David stood up, his face a mix of guilt and desperation. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said quietly. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen, but I love him, Jake." Jake recoiled as if struck. "You love him?" His voice cracked. "You don't think this is wrong? He's my best friend. You've been sleeping with my best friend." "It's not just some fling," David insisted, stepping toward him. This was real. I didn't mean to hurt you." Jake's face twisted in disgust. "You didn't mean to hurt me? How could you even think for 1 second that this wouldn't destroy everything?" David's eyes filled with regret. "I didn't know how to stop, Jake. I didn't know how to make it right." "Make it right?" Jake's voice rose. "You can't fix this. Do you even realize what you've done? You've ruined our family. I can't ever look at you the same again." Tears burned at the edges of Jake's eyes, but he blinked them back, too angry to let himself break. He stood there, trembling, staring at the man he had once idolized, now reduced to a broken, deceitful stranger. "I'm telling Mom," Jake finally said, his voice cold. "I'm not keeping this secret." David's face paled even further. "Jake, please don't. Let me explain it to her. We can fix this. We can—" "No." Jake's voice was final. "You can't fix this." With that, Jake turned and left, the sound of the door slamming echoing through the house, leaving David standing in the wreckage of their family. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. May 18th, 2022, late afternoon. The air inside the Morrison house felt thick, oppressive, as if every unspoken word and broken promise had collected into a storm waiting to erupt. Jake hadn't slept. His mind was a mess of rage, confusion, and deep betrayal. The conversations from the previous day played on a loop in his head, David's justification, Ethan's apologies, but none of it made sense. How could the two people he trusted most rip his world apart? When Jake heard the front door click open and David's footsteps in the hallway, something inside him snapped. Without thinking, he stormed downstairs, his heart pounding in his chest. Ethan was already there, standing awkwardly by the door, avoiding Jake's gaze. "What's going on?" David asked, sensing the tension as soon as he saw Jake's face. Jake's hands were shaking. His anger had simmered all night, but now it was bubbling over, threatening to consume him. He couldn't hold it back anymore. "What's going on? You really have to ask?" David's expression darkened as Jake advanced toward him. "Jake, calm down. We need to talk about this." "Talk?" Jake's voice trembled with fury. "There's nothing to talk about. You destroyed everything. Both of you." He pointed at Ethan, who shifted uncomfortably. "Jake, please," Ethan pleaded, his voice quiet. "This isn't what you think." "Shut up!" Jake roared, his face red with anger. "You don't get to talk. You're my best friend, Ethan. You were like my brother and you went behind my back. With him?" Ethan stepped forward, his hands up as if to defend himself. "Jake, I didn't mean for this to happen. Shut up!" Jake exploded, shoving Ethan hard. Ethan stumbled back, crashing into the wall behind him. David immediately stepped between them, his voice calm but strained. "Jake, stop. We need to cool down. This won't solve anything." But Jake couldn't hear him. All the pain, all the betrayal, everything he'd kept bottled up for so long was boiling over. He looked at David, the man he had once admired, the father he had trusted with his entire heart, and all he could see was the lie. "You're not my father anymore," Jake spat, his voice trembling with raw emotion. "You're a liar, a cheat, you—" His words caught in his throat, and before he knew it, his fist was flying. The punch landed squarely on David's jaw, sending him reeling backward into the coffee table, knocking over the vase that shattered across the floor. David gasped, clutching his face, his eyes wide with shock. Jake felt no satisfaction from the blow. It only made the fire inside him burn hotter. "Jake, stop it!" Ethan shouted, rushing forward to pull Jake away, but Jake turned on him with a wild look in his eyes. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You're part of this." Jake grabbed Ethan by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "I trusted you!" he screamed, his voice cracking with the weight of it all. Ethan struggled in Jake's grip, his voice desperate. "Jake, please, I'm sorry." But Jake didn't let go. Years of pent-up anger, confusion, and emotional trauma all came crashing down at once. His mind was a blur of pain and betrayal, and he wasn't thinking clearly anymore. All he knew was that he couldn't take it. Not the lies, not the deception, not the sickening sense that everything he thought he knew had been ripped away. Ethan tried to push Jake off, but the movement only fueled Jake's rage. Without thinking, Jake swung again, this time harder. His fist connected with Ethan's temple, and Ethan crumpled to the floor. There was a sickening thud as Ethan's head hit the corner of the table on the way down. The world stopped. The room went silent, the sound of Jake's heavy breathing the only noise in the house. David rushed over, dropping to his knees beside Ethan, who lay motionless on the floor, blood trickling from the side of his head. "Oh my God, Ethan!" David cried, shaking him, panic seeping into his voice. "Ethan, wake up!" Jake stood frozen, his hands trembling, his heart pounding in his ears. He couldn't believe what had just happened. 1 second, he had been consumed by rage, and the next, this. Ethan wasn't moving. "Jake!" David's voice was sharp now, frantic. "Call an ambulance! Jake, do something!" But Jake couldn't move. He stared down at Ethan's still body, the blood pooling on the floor. His vision blurred with tears as the reality of what he had done crashed over him. I didn't mean to," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to," but it was too late. The damage was done. Ethan was dead, and nothing would ever be the same again. The house was silent now, the chaotic noise of the violent confrontation replaced by an unbearable stillness. Jake sat on the living room floor, his back against the wall, staring blankly at the bloodstain that had seeped into the carpet. Ethan was gone. His best friend, the person he had shared his life with, now lay lifeless because of him. Jake's chest felt tight, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him with crushing force. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan lying on the floor, David's panicked cries still echoing in his ears. "I didn't mean to." The words replayed in his mind, but they were hollow now. Nothing could undo the moment his anger had spiraled out of control. Nothing could change the fact that he had killed Ethan. His world, the one he had known and trusted, was in ruins. The idyllic family life he had clung to was a lie, shattered by his father's betrayal, Ethan's complicity, and his own uncontrollable rage. It felt like the ground had been ripped from under him, and now there was nothing but empty space, endless and unforgiving. Jake's mind drifted to what could have been. What if David had never lied? What if Ethan had come to him, told him the truth? What if he had walked away instead of letting his anger take control? He could almost see it. A different life, one where they had talked through the pain, where things hadn't ended like this. But that life would never exist. There was no going back. With each passing second, the weight of his choices settled deeper into his bones. This was it, the end of everything he had known. Ethan was gone, his father a broken man, and his family would never be whole again. The lies, the forbidden love, the deception, they had all led to this. Jake closed his eyes, the bitter taste of regret choking him. He couldn't escape the truth now. He had destroyed everything, and nothing would ever be the same again.